starting disassembly of this transmission. So what we're going to do is remove the dipstick tube, remove the bell housing, remove the extension housing, and then we're going to roll the transmission to where the output shaft is pointed down at the floor. When that's happening, we're actually going to drain out the transmission so all the fluid's gone. We'll take a minute and take a look at the fluid once we get the pan off to try and figure out what's wrong with this transmission, because I have no idea what's wrong with it. It could be perfectly good, it could be absolutely trash on the inside, it could have a slipped clutch, a broken band, I don't know, but we're going to find out. So I'm going to start by removing the bell housing. Now this is using a T50 on this particular model, a Torx 50, and I've already loosened them, so it's going to look easy, but it's sometimes not going to be. Like that right there. There we go. So we get a ratchet on it. Now this bell housing will fall off once you get the last bolt out. So make sure you have a hand on it so you don't drop it, hurt yourself. There we go. Got them all out. Yep. And it just comes right off. So there's our bell housing. Just going to set this on the floor. Worry about cleaning it later. So the dipstick tube, if you just twist it, if you still have yours in there, you just twist it and it should come out. Wiggle it around. This one don't want to come out. There we go. So we got our dipstick out, our dipstick tube. Notice the dipstick that actually runs down through the tubing. Put it down on the bell housing. So we have no bell housing, we've got the front pump exposed. I'm also going to take out this seal here for the dipstick tube. Of course it's falling apart, so I'm going to use the O-ring tool. I'm going to go down into it and I'm going to peel it out of the hole there, just to get it out of the way. The next thing I'm going to do is come to the back of the transmission. First I've got to remove the transmission mount so they can access all the bolts for the extension housing. They're 15 millimeter. And just snap them loose. Now remember, if you're doing a transmission removal and installation or an overhaul, take a look at the motor mounts, take a look at the transmission mounts, because that would be the perfect time to replace them. From there, we're going to remove the extension housing bolts, which are also 15 millimeters. I'm going to move the transmission, or my pan underneath it, just because some fluid might be in there and I don't want it to dribble on the floor. Take off the extension. Don't need it this time. Just bump it. Now these extension housings, they just use a single square cut O-ring to seal them. So make sure you take it off and make sure you put the new one back on there, because you don't want to have an old extension housing O-ring. Now what I'm going to do is take the transmission, I'm going to pull the pin, and I'm going to rotate the transmission to where this is up and this is down, and you should be able to see the fluid start to drain out of it. And transmissions are one of those things that they will drain forever. If we drain this thing like this for a month and we come back and rolled it back up into this position, it would still have fluid in it. So always assume there's fluid in the transmission. While it's in this position, I'm going to go ahead and remove the transmission pan, which is a series of 13 millimeter bolts around here on the side of the transmission, on the bottom of the transmission. Just taking the top two loose, I'm going to remove the rest of them. see it's already starting to leak from the transmission pan just because the bolts are out. Now I've got all the bolts that were tight out. I still left in my top two. Now I'm going to break it loose just to let what comes out there in a little more controlled manner. I'm also listening for any pieces that might fall out into my pan. All right, so it's come all the way off. I got the pan. There we go. So this transmission pan looks like it's had some water in it. Now that we've got the transmission pan off, we can take a look at it because this is our first indication of possible failures inside this transmission. Now notice this pan doesn't have very much clutch material in the bottom of it, if any at all, but it does have some things floating around inside it, like we've got what feels like a piece of rubber or silicone in there. There's another piece up here that feels like similar, maybe a harder plastic material. If we look at the magnet, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of metallic stuff left on the magnet, but there is more of the silicone stuff there. It kind of feels like a gooey booger. But there's really not a lot of metal. Now I think there's a reason for that, and that reason might be that this transmission has actually been recently serviced, and maybe they were trying to fix a problem. So notice on this pan it does have a drain plug. Not every transmission has that, so it's got that drain plug right there. Another thing about it, if you see that the fluid over here on this top left, the fluid is nice and red, but if you look at it across the surface, it actually looks a little bit milky. That could be because it had water in it, and it ran with the water in it because that's the way it's going to mix, is once it gets pumped through the front pump and goes through the valve body and the clutches, the water and the oil will start to mix up and create this pink, kind of a Pepto-Bismol or a strawberry milkshake type color to it. But other than that, I really don't see any issues with the pan. So we're going to keep going. I don't see any hard metal. I do see dirt down in there, but that could be from somebody trying to work on it or fix it. Now here we are at the transmission valve body. We've got our our filter, and it's just pressed into the transmission's front pump here. Once we pull this off, then we'll be able to access the valve body bolts and everything. We're zoomed in a little bit closer at the transmission, so we've got our filter. It's just pressed in up here to the front pump. It goes through the case into the pump. And above the filter in this transmission, we have our valve body. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my O-ring tool. I'm just going to stick it inside here, and I'm just going to slowly start to pop that filter out. And you see we've got the filter right there. Look on the top of the filter. Obviously this one's been serviced because it is really clean, and it's also got a moth right there. So there's a little bit of material and a little bit there, but really nothing to be worried about. Like I said, it's been cleaned before. So inside there's the filter element, and it's not much. It's just basically a gauze to keep out large chunks. So I'm going to roll the transmission onto its back, and then we'll start taking out the valve body bolts. Transmission's rolled on its back, and we have access to the whole valve body and the wiring. All right, in this transmission, so the bulkhead connector that we talked about that goes through the top side, that connector right there, that connector goes through the case. It's got some O-rings for sealing to keep the fluid in, and it comes to this wiring harness right here. This harness is a flexible lead harness, and notice it just sits down on the bolts to keep it retained, because once the filter's in place, it's held in place, and it doesn't need to be bolted down. Now we come to these connectors. So there's a couple different types of connectors in here, and these connectors have they just have this part of the connector, the latch, that actually flips up. Don't just pull back on it, but you want to push back on it and then also push it in that direction, and it'll slide off pretty easily, and you'll be able to unplug it. Now this transmission, the way it's designed, you cannot remove this harness entirely until you have the valve body off to be able to access everything, because over here in the front of the transmission we have a solenoid that's actually bolted in and hardwired to this harness. So it's going to stay in there until we can access it to be able to get this solenoid out, and then if we need to, we can actually pop the bulkhead connector out because it's all retained by the valve body. So we're unplugging the solenoid here. Okay, and we got our solenoid and our pressure switch and oil temperature sensor unplugged, and then we have our electronic pressure control solenoid right here, and this one here, if you just grab the wires and wiggle it and pull it back. I know grabbing the wires is a bad thing. Looks like it's going to be a little stuck on there. So I'm going to take my screwdriver, put it right here, and then just try to pop it back. There we go. And then we got it off. So the way it was being held was there's a clip that was down on the back side holding onto the solenoid. And by going back behind it, I was able to lift it up. Now notice we lift, the wiring harness is just going to hang out just like that for us to get the rest of it. Because we're going to remove this accumulator housing here. We're going to remove the bolts out of the valve body, and we'll be able to lift the valve body up. And we'll be leaving a metal plate or a separator plate down on the transmission. So we'll have to then unbolt it and take it off. All right, now we're going to go ahead and use the socket. It's a 10 millimeter for all the ones in the valve body. Then we have, I believe there's some 8 millimeters back here and some reinforcing plates. Now there is a 13 on this side that's holding the parking, the rooster comb spring. So I'm going to go ahead and take that one off since we're here, and that'll help reduce tension as we're trying to lift this thing up. There we go. So this is the spring that you feel when you put the transmission into gear. Okay, so when you're shifting the transmission back and forth from park, reverse, neutral, drive, like this position is park, and the lever's attached here, and there'd be a cable from the shifter attached here, this shaft is going to rotate. And as it rotates, it's moving this piece right here, which is called the rooster comb, okay, or the detent bracket. And as it moves back and forth, those positions that you feel the transmission snap into are actually these cutouts in the comb here, and then this spring is being pressed down into them. So that spring sits down in it, and as we shift this thing back and forth, of course this is stationary. There we go, it's stationary like that. And as you shift this back and forth, it goes up and down inside those. So that's actually what's holding the position. Now beyond that, when you put a transmission in gear, the other two things that you're doing, for one, park, which is going to be that piece that's moving back and forth. Park, there's the parking rod is going to go all the way back and engage the parking pawl and the parking gear. Once you pull it out of park, all this thing's doing is just riding back and forth. What else you're doing is you're moving this linkage. Okay, so this linkage here is connected to what's called the manual valve. This is all you're doing when you're shifting this thing into reverse, neutral, drive, 3, 2, 1, depending on what's on the shifter, is you're just moving this valve. And this is a hydraulic valve that goes through the valve body right here, and it controls the hydraulic circuits and who gets pressure and who gets flow depending on its position. You have to get this rod back into this and back onto the shift bracket here. If you miss it, the transmission will go into, we'll call it reverse when it's actually in neutral, and the vehicle will move if nobody's in it holding the brake. So very important, okay? Let's go ahead and remove the valve body bolts. Those are 10 millimeter. Just going to go ahead and remove all of them. Of course, there's a couple 8s in here too. Oh, no, that's an 8. That's an 8. There's a 10. If you look at the workshop manual, it'll tell you which ones to remove. And it's kind of like an engine. As you're detorquing, you want to start from the outside and work your way in towards the center. It's just a good habit to have. All right, so let me go ahead and get my 8. Now some of these bolts are not threaded all the way through. So we have this bolt here. You see how long it is? It's definitely going to go through the valve body into the case and hold the valve body. But this one here is really just for this pressure switch assembly. So we don't have to take out these two 8mm yet. I'm going to go ahead and take out these other 8s because they do go through the case, through to the case. Okay, so we've gone all the way around the perimeter. The last ones that we have left are the few left in the middle here. Okay, now it's going to happen sometimes that you're going to leave a bolt in, so you do not have to pry on these things to get them off with a lot of force. It should just pop up very easily. So I'm just back here, and really I push down with maybe 1/2 pound of force, and it's already lifting up the valve body. Okay, it's lifting it up and it's ready to come out. Now, where do you put it on the table? The valve body, because it's essentially the nervous system of the transmission, we need to take care of it. We need to put it somewhere safe. We need to put it in a somewhat clean environment. So the best place for it while you're working on the transmission is in the transmission pan. So I'm going to take this valve body and I'm going to stick it over there in the pan so it's safe. Well, safer. It's not going to be perfectly safe. I'm going to lift it up. There's always going to be some bolts that weren't unscrewed all the way, so just if it doesn't come up, then stop and just spin the bolts, make sure you got them all out. You'll lift up the valve body, make sure you disconnect the linkage rod for the manual valve, and then put the valve body over here in the pan. Now we've removed the valve body and we've come to our first issue, big issue with these 4L60s. On the transmission, what's left on here is a steel plate, okay, and this steel plate is called the separator plate. It has a gasket on both sides, but it also has precisely drilled holes, which are called orifices, so when fluid gets applied to it, the fluid pressure drop from high side to low side or downstream is a very specific amount. Sitting on this separator plate are some check balls. So we have a check ball here, one there, one there, one there. We've got 2 over here. And when I was saying this is one of the first problem that we're going to run into in the 4L60s is this check ball right here. Might be a little difficult to see until I do a comparison, but we see this check ball and that check ball. We get the handheld. Okay, so we've got our check balls. We got this one, see how high it is on the surface, and I can actually pop it out of the separator plate. This one here is actually flush with the surface. Well, not flush, it's actually pressed down into the separator plate. And what happens with that is this plate material is kind of soft. And these balls they're pushed out of the hole, then they're pushed back into the hole with hydraulic pressure. And if it happens enough, thousands and thousands of times, because all the shifts in the life of the transmission, that ball will actually make its way through the separator plate. And the way to fix that is to replace the separator plate. Now the good thing is that GM has them still available, but even better is that the aftermarket has addressed this issue. So let me get a little bit better shot and come down here closer. Let me back up. There we go. All right, so again about the ball. See this one here, I can move it out of the hole very easily. This one, it's actually stuck in the hole. And if we try to get a profile shot of this thing, if I get my camera to focus, there we go. See that ball is proud right here. I can pop it out. And then we have this one over here. There's a ball in there, but guess what? She's not moving, she's stuck in the hole. And this is a common thing on the 4L60s. Okay, so we've got our transmission valve body off. Now the balls, it's good to note their position. The workshop manuals will usually be good about noting their positions, but I like to note it in a different way, just so that this transmission, if it's ever been rebuilt or say it's been updated somehow, the balls might have an additional one or one less, just because somebody has decided to change it at a manufacturer or a parts manufacturer. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to gather the balls and put them in the pan with the transmission valve body. So just grab them with a magnet. And these, all oh, see, that one's actually, it was stuck there. There we go, we got that one out. Got this one out. But all of these check balls, the holes that they're leaving are supposed to be a nice square edge, and these are not. They're actually been hammered in by the ball. So I can't get that one out. Probably just going to leave that in so I can kind of expand on that idea. Removing the accumulator. Now this is going to have some spring pressure against it. On some of them it'll have a lot, some of them it'll have none. Okay, and this runs into another issue with these transmissions, not so much with this accumulator, but with the plate on the transmission. Okay, so inside here we have a piston. Oops, there we go. We got a piston, and on top of that piston are a series of springs, either 1 or 2 springs, depending on the specification. So I've removed the accumulator. The other problem is that right here on the separator plate, the springs will actually push down against the plate, or push from the other side, because there's springs on the other side, and they will actually deform the plate. This one seems pretty straight, but because we've got ball stuck in the hole, and then the seats are actually deformed, we're going to replace this plate anyway. All right, so we have some 8mm over here. Take them out. And we've got the valve body off. And now we're going with the separator plate. All the parts I'm putting in the pan. And when I pull this up, depending on the transmission, because some transmissions will have valve bodies in the case, some of them will only have them in the valve body, some of them, you know, they won't have check balls at all. But we can see that that ball is actually stuck in that hole quite well. So take the bolt that I just took off the reinforcing plate and put it in there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this pin out right here for the accumulator. And if I grab it just right, I can pull the accumulator out. Now sitting on that accumulator was a spring. And what this acts like is basically a hydraulic shock absorber. Let's say pressure is going to be fed to a clutch to cause second gear to happen. So that means the intermediate overdrive band will come on. Pressure will go through this passage and then go off to the band. Now this isn't exactly how this works, but this is the idea. And as it goes through it, it's going to try and pressurize the band, but it's also going to try and pressurize the area on the bottom side of this piston. And when it does that, it's going to compress the spring. And that spring is going to help to soften the shift. And that's just a general idea of how they work. Now I can get to my torque converter clutch solenoid, so I'm going to pull the harness back over this way. I'm going to take these 10mm out so that I can get the torque converter clutch solenoid out. This one actually goes down into the front pump, so we have to remove it so that we can get the front pump out. Now the next thing that we want to do is, don't ever pry on this surface, but we can pry slightly over here just to lift this guy up and out. Just get underneath it somehow and just pop it up. It just has a single O-ring holding it down into the pump. And most people just take this harness and just hang it over the side if they're just going to leave it in place, because in all honesty, most of them are just left in place because they can be a bit of a bear to get out of there. Let's see if this one's going to be a bear. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a bear. All right, so we've got the valve body off, we've got our torque converter clutch solenoid, we've got our accumulator out of the case. Next thing I'm going to do is remove the part pawl, the rooster comb, and the shifting shaft. Now on the shift shaft, there is a clip down on the bottom side, which is a positioning clip, keeps it from moving too far in or out. And I'm just going to pop that clip off. Almost got it, there we go. So the clip actually, well, now it's stuck down in the transmission. The clip goes down over the shaft to keep the shaft from moving back and forth too much. And you can see that it snaps over the shaft there. Put that in the pan because that's a good place for it. The next thing I'm going to do is remove this 13 millimeter so that I can get the park pawl bracket out of there. And this is going to give me access to the park pawl. Oh yeah, I forgot there's one more bolt down there. It's the one. All right, put it in the pan, lift up our bracket, and we see that we have our park rod, and down below it is the park pawl. So what I want you to do is while you're pushing on this, just turn the output shaft if you can. You hear that squealing is normal. And then put it in park. There you go, you got park. That's what park is in an automatic transmission, is that little guy right there. The next thing I'm going to do is get my wrench, and I'm actually going to break this nut loose so that I can back the shaft out of the housing. So the nut on these is usually a 15 millimeter, and if you just go back against it like that, and all you have to do is just break it loose and just wrench it off for a little bit, and you'll eventually be able to just use your fingers to loosen it or take it all the way off. Now you're not going to be able to remove the nut because the shaft has captured it, but once you get the nut all the way off, the nut becomes loose, and then you can actually tap the rooster comb off the shaft. And just kind of wiggle it back and forth, and it'll eventually come off of the shift shaft. Just on there with a bit of an interference fit on it. All right, so it's come loose. I can slide the shaft out of the case if it's not too damaged from the rooster comb. Let me get the nut out. And I can pull the comb out. I might have to pry on it just a little bit. So I'm just going to pry on the shaft to try and pop it out of the case just a little bit more. I think what we have is a little bit of damage on the end of our shaft here, so let me pause for a minute and come back. We've got the shaft out of there. Now we can pull up on the rooster comb, and you can see the bumps right there. Those are actually the positions of the shifter. I'm going to put that in the pan, and that's pretty much everything that's going to go in the pan. All right, so we've reached the end of the bow housing, the tail shaft housing or extension housing, and removing the valve body. The next video is going to be removing our 2/4 servo, the front pump, and basically all the internals of the transmission. Now that we have the valve body off, we can actually see some of these squiggly lines in here. These are actually all hydraulic circuits. They are in essence, they're kind of like the wiring harness of the transmission. So what they provide is a path for hydraulic fluid to go from one place to another. So if we want to apply a clutch, or it needs to apply a band or release it, they'll apply it to a circuit, and it may not directly go to that component or that apply component or element, but it'll go through and it'll go to another valve in the valve body, and then that valve body will then transfer the pressure to another portion and then travel up to an apply port for whatever component it is. So this is basically we'll call it the wiring harness of the valve body. Now there is another ball that was located right there. Got that one. There is a ball back here, but this one is actually a captured check ball. The captured check ball should not come out because it actually has a little cage that's around it that keeps it from moving, because there's nothing above it, or say there's not enough, there's too much clearance below it that it would actually fall out from its position. So it's actually set down into the case inside a little cartridge or a cage that keeps it in place. Now, when we come back for the next video, we'll be removing the 2/4 servo, and then removing the pump, and then removing all of the major assemblies inside the transmission. and we'll see you then.